Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of Forbidden History for Sleep. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving deep into something that might just surprise you: the daily grind of medieval monks. Now, before you drift off thinking about peaceful prayer and illuminated manuscripts, let me tell you something. These weren't just holy men copying scripture by candlelight. They were running what was essentially medieval civilization's waste management department, medical facilities, and industrial operations all rolled into one. So grab your pillow, dim those lights, and settle in as we explore the surprisingly unglamorous world of monastic life. Because by the end of tonight's journey, you'll understand that behind those stone walls and sacred vows was a reality far grittier than any Hollywood depiction could capture. Now, if you're new here, welcome to the most relaxing corner of YouTube where history meets your need for sleep. We take the fascinating stories of the past and present them in that perfect tone for winding down. And if you're a regular listener, you know exactly what you're in for. Hit that subscribe button if you enjoy falling asleep to the gentle rhythm of historical storytelling. Tonight, we begin in the damp stone corridors of a medieval monastery. The year is 1347. The sun hasn't yet crested the horizon, but Brother Thomas is already awake. Not by choice, mind you. The bell for matins has just finished echoing through the dormitory, and like every other morning for the past 12 years, he's stumbling toward what most people would consider the least enviable job in medieval Europe. You see, Brother Thomas isn't heading to the scriptorium to copy beautiful texts. He's not walking to the herb garden to tend healing plants. No, Brother Thomas is the monastery's gong farmer, and if you don't know what that means, well, you're about to learn why medieval monastic life was far from the peaceful retreat most people imagine. Medieval monasteries weren't just centers of prayer and learning. They were complex, self-sustaining communities that had to deal with all the messy realities of human existence. And someone had to handle the mess, literally. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, established the foundation for monastic life across Europe. It spoke of prayer, work, and community living. But what it didn't mention in detail was just how much of that work involved dealing with human waste, rotting food, diseased animals, and the general filth that accumulated when hundreds of people lived together in close quarters. Every monastery had its essential but unpleasant jobs. Someone had to clean the latrines. Someone had to dispose of kitchen scraps and spoiled food. Someone had to tend to the sick during plague outbreaks. Someone had to slaughter animals, tan hides, and process the blood and offal. These weren't jobs you could simply ignore or delegate to servants. In the monastic world, all work was considered sacred, no matter how disagreeable. Brother Thomas reaches the monastery's latrine block, a long stone building with rows of wooden seats positioned over a channel that carries waste away from the living quarters. The smell hits him first, as it does every morning. A mixture of human waste, lime, and the herbs scattered to mask the odor. It's not pleasant, but after 12 years, his nose has learned to accept what it cannot change. The latrine cleaning is methodical work. First, he sprinkles fresh lime down each seat to help control the smell and break down waste. Then comes the scrubbing. Using long-handled brushes and buckets of water carried from the well, he scrubs each wooden seat, each stone surface, working his way down the entire length of the building. But this is just the beginning of his day. Once the latrines are clean, Brother Thomas must check the waste channels that run beneath the monastery. These medieval sewage systems were actually quite sophisticated for their time, channeling waste away from living areas and toward collection points outside the walls. But they required constant maintenance. Armed with a long rake and wearing his oldest robe, Brother Thomas wades into the shallow channels to clear blockages. Sticks, rags, and other debris regularly clog the flow, creating backups that can flood the latrine floors with sewage. It's cold, wet, smelly work that must be done regardless of weather or season. The waste doesn't simply disappear once it leaves the monastery walls. Medieval communities understood the value of human waste as fertilizer long before modern agriculture rediscovered the practice. Brother Thomas oversees the monastery's waste management system, ensuring that sewage is properly composted and aged before being spread on the fields that feed the community. This process takes months. Fresh human waste can carry disease and burn crop roots, so it must be mixed with straw, food scraps, and animal waste, then left to decompose in carefully maintained piles. Brother Thomas turns these compost heaps regularly, monitors their temperature, and tests their readiness for agricultural use. It's scientific work disguised as menial labor. The success of the monastery's crops depends on proper waste management, and Brother Thomas has become an expert in the chemistry of decomposition. He knows which combinations of materials break down fastest, which produce the richest fertilizer, and how to manage the process to minimize odor and pest problems. But waste management is only part of his responsibilities. Medieval monasteries were also centers of medical care, and that medical care often involved dealing with bodily fluids that would make modern nurses queasy. Brother Thomas assists the monastery's infirmara, the monk responsible for caring for the sick and injured. Medieval medicine was a messy business. Bloodletting was a common treatment, requiring someone to clean up the blood afterward. Patients with dysentery, plague, or other diseases produced constant streams of vomit, diarrhea, and other bodily fluids. Infected wounds needed to be drained and cleaned regularly. Surgery, when it was attempted, was performed without anesthesia and produced considerable blood loss. Brother Thomas has seen it all. He's held basins to catch blood during primitive surgical procedures. He's cleaned vomit from patients suffering from food poisoning or disease. He's disposed of amputated limbs and removed gangrenous tissue from infected wounds. He's washed soiled bedding and clothing countless times, scrubbing out stains that would challenge modern detergents. The monastery's infirmary is a place where the theoretical meets the practical in often unpleasant ways. Medical texts might describe treatments in clean, academic language, but the reality involves wrestling with delirious patients, cleaning up after procedures gone wrong, and disposing of medical waste that would horrify modern health inspectors. During plague outbreaks, Brother Thomas's job becomes even more challenging. Bodies must be removed quickly to prevent the spread of disease. Personal belongings of the dead must be cleaned or burned. Entire rooms must be scrubbed with vinegar and lime to kill whatever invisible forces cause illness to spread. The monastery kitchen presents its own set of unpleasant challenges. Medieval food storage was primitive by modern standards, and spoilage was constant. Someone had to identify and dispose of rotting meat, moldy bread, and vegetables gone bad. Someone had to clean the slaughter area where animals were butchered for the community's meals. Brother Thomas often assists in the kitchen, and he's become expert at recognizing the signs of food spoilage. Meat that's starting to turn has a particular smell and texture. Grain infested with weevils requires careful sorting to separate the edible from the inedible. Vegetables stored in root cellars must be regularly inspected and rotting specimens removed before they contaminate the entire supply. The slaughter of animals is perhaps the most challenging part of kitchen work. Medieval monasteries raised their own livestock, and when animals were ready for slaughter, the process was neither quick nor clean. Brother Thomas has learned to kill chickens, pigs, and cattle efficiently, but the work involves considerable blood, offal, and waste that must be properly handled. Nothing is wasted in medieval monastery kitchens. Animal blood is saved for making sausages, organs are cleaned and prepared for consumption. Even intestines are cleaned and used as sausage casings. But all of this processing creates mess that someone must clean up, and that someone is often Brother Thomas. The monastery's brewery and bakery also require regular cleaning that goes far beyond wiping down surfaces. Medieval brewing involved large vats of fermenting grain that could go wrong in spectacular ways. A batch of beer that's been contaminated produces smells and textures that would challenge anyone's stomach. The vats must be emptied, scrubbed clean, and prepared for the next batch.
Oh.
Similarly, the bakery's ovens require constant maintenance. Ashes must be removed, surfaces scrubbed, and the chimney cleaned to prevent fires. The process of making bread in large quantities produces considerable waste flour, spoiled dough, and burnt loaves that must be disposed of properly. Brother Thomas has also been assigned to assist with the monastery's scriptorium, though his role there isn't copying beautiful manuscripts. Instead, he prepares the materials that make manuscript production possible. This involves some of the most unpleasant work in the entire monastery. Medieval parchment was made from animal skins, and preparing those skins was a lengthy, smelly process. Brother Thomas soaks animal hides in lime solutions to remove hair and flesh. He scrapes skins clean using curved knives, removing every trace of meat and fat. He stretches wet skins on frames to dry, then sands them smooth enough for writing. The process takes weeks and produces smells that permeate clothing and skin. The lime solutions are caustic and burn unprotected hands. The scraping work is backbreaking, requiring hours of bent-over labor with sharp tools, and the end result, beautiful white parchment ready for illuminated manuscripts, bears no resemblance to the bloody, smelly hides that Brother Thomas started with. Ink production is another messy process. Medieval ink was made from a variety of materials, including oak galls, iron sulfate, and various plant dyes. These materials must be ground, mixed, and strained to produce smooth, consistent ink. The process stains everything it touches and produces toxic fumes that make eyes water and throats burn. Brother Thomas grinds oak galls into powder, strains plant dyes through cloth, and mixes ingredients in precise proportions to create different colors of ink. His hands are permanently stained from the work, and his robes bear the marks of countless ink spills and chemical splashes. The monastery workshop presents its own challenges. Medieval communities had to produce most of what they needed, from tools to clothing to furniture. This meant working with materials and processes that were often dangerous and always messy. Metalworking requires a forge that produces intense heat, toxic fumes, and considerable waste. Brother Thomas tends the forge fires, operates the bellows that keep temperatures high enough to work iron, and assists with the hammering and shaping of metal objects. The work is hot, smoky, and dangerous, with sparks that can burn skin and eyes that water from the smoke. Leatherworking is another essential but unpleasant craft. Animal hides must be treated with various chemicals to transform them from rotting organic matter into durable leather. The process involves soaking hides in solutions of bark, urine, and other materials that produce smells strong enough to make visitors gag. Brother Thomas helps tan hides by soaking them in pits filled with oak bark solutions. He scrapes excess flesh from skins using sharp knives. He rubs animal brains into leather to make it soft and supple. The work is smelly, messy, and requires handling materials that most people would find disgusting. Candle making is essential for a community that lives by candlelight, but the process involves working with animal fat that quickly turns rancid in warm weather. Brother Thomas helps render fat from slaughtered animals, straining out impurities and heating the result until it's suitable for candle making. The smell of rendering fat is nauseating, especially when the fat has begun to spoil. The monastery's agricultural work also has its unpleasant aspects. Fields must be fertilized with animal manure, which means loading carts with fresh dung and spreading it by hand across croplands. The work is smelly, and flies are constant companions during the warm months. Brother Thomas helps muck out animal stalls, loading wheelbarrows with soiled straw and manure. He spreads this mixture across vegetable gardens and crop fields, working it into the soil with primitive tools. The work is back-breaking and aromatic, especially during hot summer months, when the smell of manure becomes overwhelming. Animal care itself involves constant cleaning. Stalls must be mucked out daily. Water troughs must be scrubbed clean and refilled. Sick animals require special care that often involves cleaning up vomit, diarrhea, and other bodily fluids. Medieval monasteries also served as hospitals for the surrounding community, and this medical work exposed monks to diseases and conditions that would challenge modern healthcare workers. Brother Thomas assists with treating plague victims, accident victims, and people suffering from a variety of medieval ailments. The sight of infected wounds, gangrenous limbs, and disease-ravaged bodies is part of his daily routine. He holds patients down during primitive surgical procedures. He cleans infected wounds with whatever antiseptics are available, usually wine or vinegar. He helps dispose of amputated limbs and removes bandages soaked with pus and blood. The monastery's role as a centre of learning also brought its own unpleasant realities. When scholars and visitors arrived seeking knowledge, someone had to prepare accommodations that were often less than pristine. Brother Thomas found himself cleaning guest quarters that had been occupied by travellers who brought with them the dirt and disease of medieval roads. Visiting scholars weren't always the clean, dignified figures depicted in illuminated manuscripts. Many arrived after weeks of travel, their clothing filthy, their bodies unwashed, carrying fleas and lice that quickly spread throughout the monastery. Brother Thomas learned to recognize the signs of various parasites and developed techniques for dealing with infestations that could shut down entire sections of the monastery. The guest quarters required thorough cleaning between visitors. Straw mattresses had to be completely replaced if they showed signs of infestation. Wooden bed frames needed to be scrubbed with lye solutions strong enough to kill insects, but harsh enough to burn skin. Wall hangings and curtains had to be beaten, aired, and sometimes burned if the infestation was severe enough. Medieval hygiene standards were practically non-existent by modern measures, but monasteries had to maintain higher standards than secular communities simply to prevent disease from wiping out the entire population. Brother Thomas became expert at identifying the early signs of plague, dysentery, and other diseases that could devastate enclosed communities. When disease did strike, the cleanup work was both dangerous and disgusting. Infected bedding had to be removed and burned. Rooms had to be fumigated with smoking herbs and vinegar solutions. Bodies of plague victims required special handling to prevent further spread of disease, and Brother Thomas was often the one called upon to perform these grim tasks. The monastery's role as a centre of charity also created sanitation challenges. Poor travellers seeking alms often arrived in deplorable condition, suffering from malnutrition, disease, and the effects of exposure. The monastery's obligation to provide care meant dealing with conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. Brother Thomas helped wash and treat beggars suffering from skin diseases, infected wounds, and malnutrition so severe it had caused their bodies to waste away. He cleaned up after travellers who suffered from dysentery or food poisoning. He helped remove clothing so filthy it had essentially rotted onto people's bodies. The charity kitchen, where free meals were distributed to the poor, required constant cleaning to prevent the spread of disease. Bowls and utensils used by diseased travellers had to be thoroughly cleaned between uses. The serving areas had to be scrubbed daily to remove accumulated filth, and Brother Thomas was responsible for disposing of leftover food that could spoil quickly in warm weather. Medieval monasteries also served as centres of textile production, and this work involved processes that were both labour-intensive and unpleasant. Wool had to be cleaned of lanolin, dirt, and parasites before it could be spun into thread. The cleaning process involved soaking fleece in solutions of urine and lye that produced overwhelming odours. Brother Thomas helped process wool by trampling it in large vats filled with cleaning solutions. The work required standing for hours in caustic liquids that burned feet and legs. His job was to stomp the wool clean, removing dirt and oils while trying not to inhale the toxic fumes that rose from the cleaning baths. Dyeing cloth was another messy process that required handling materials that were often dangerous. Many medieval dyes were made from insects, plants, or minerals that could cause skin reactions or worse. Brother Thomas ground cochineal beetles into red dye, extracted blue colouring from woad plants, and mixed various chemicals to create the colours needed for monastery textiles. The dye vats had to be maintained at specific temperatures and stirred constantly during the dyeing process. This meant working over steaming cauldrons that filled the workshop with humid, toxic air. The dyes stained everything they touched, including Brother Thomas's skin and clothing, marking him permanently as someone who worked with these materials. Cloth finishing required additional unpleasant processes. Wool cloth had to be fulled by soaking it in solutions of clay and urine, then pounding it with wooden mallets to make it dense and water-resistant. The pounding work was exhausting, and the smell of fermenting urine was nauseating, especially in warm weather. Brother Thomas also helped with the monastery's soap making, one of the few cleaning products available in medieval times. Soap production required rendering animal fat, mixing it with lye made from wood ashes, and cooking the mixture for hours until it reached the proper consistency. The process was dangerous because lye solutions could cause severe burns, and the rendering fat produced overwhelming odours. The monastery's mill required regular maintenance that involved some of the dirtiest work on the premises. Watermills used for grinding grain accumulated debris that had to be cleared by hand. Brother Thomas regularly waded into mill ponds to remove branches, leaves, and dead animals that could jam the water wheel. The grinding stones themselves required periodic cleaning and resharpening. This work involved lifting massive stones, cleaning grain dust from every surface, and using primitive tools to maintain the cutting edges that ground wheat into flour. The work was dangerous because the stones could crush limbs if they shifted unexpectedly. Mill ponds also served as breeding grounds for insects and disease during warm weather. Brother Thomas learned to recognize the signs of stagnant water that could harbor illness and develop techniques for maintaining water flow that would prevent problems. This often meant working in waist-deep water to clear obstructions or redirect water channels. The monastery's fish ponds presented their own maintenance challenges. Medieval communities relied heavily on fish for protein, especially during religious fasting periods when meat was forbidden. But maintaining fish ponds required constant attention to prevent disease and ensure adequate food supplies. Brother Thomas helped clean fish ponds by removing dead fish before they could contaminate the water supply. He learned to recognize signs of fish diseases and develop methods for treating sick fish populations. The work often involved wading through muddy pond bottoms to remove debris and maintain proper water circulation. When fish were harvested for meals, the processing work was messy and smelly. Brother Thomas helped gut and clean hundreds of fish at a time, working quickly to prevent spoilage. The fish waste had to be disposed of carefully to prevent attracting scavengers or creating health hazards around the monastery. Salt preservation of fish required additional labour that was both tedious and unpleasant. Fish had to be packed in salt, stacked in specific patterns, and monitored for signs of spoilage. The salt drew moisture from the fish, creating brines that had to be drained and replaced regularly. The smell of salted fish permeated everything nearby and could be overwhelming in warm weather. The monastery's beer production, essential for daily nutrition since water was often unsafe to drink, created its own sanitation challenges. Brewing vats had to be kept scrupulously clean to prevent contamination that could ruin entire batches of beer. Brother Thomas learned to recognize the signs of infected brews and developed cleaning techniques that would prevent problems. When brewing went wrong, the cleanup was spectacular. Contaminated beer could produce gases that caused barrels to explode, covering everything nearby with spoiled grain mash. Brother Thomas cleaned up after these disasters, scrubbing fermenting grain from walls, floors, and ceilings while trying not to breathe the toxic fumes. The hop gardens that supplied brewing ingredients required careful maintenance to prevent pest infestations that could destroy entire crops. Brother Thomas learned to identify plant diseases and pest problems, developing organic treatments that would protect the plants without contaminating the beer they would eventually flavour. Barrel maintenance was another essential but unpleasant task. Wooden barrels used for beer storage had to be kept moist to prevent cracking, but this created ideal conditions for mould growth. Brother Thomas regularly scrubbed barrels with salt water and vinegar solutions to prevent contamination, working in cramped spaces that made the job both difficult and uncomfortable. The monastery's bakery operations required maintaining wood-fired ovens that produced considerable ash and soot. Brother Thomas helped clean these ovens between baking sessions, scraping out accumulated ash and soot, while trying not to inhale the fine particles that could damage lungs. Bread production in large quantities created substantial waste that had to be managed carefully. Spoiled dough, burnt loaves, and flour contaminated with weevils all required disposal that would prevent pest problems. Brother Thomas learned to compost organic waste in ways that would enrich soil without attracting rodents or insects. The monastery's vegetable gardens required constant attention to prevent crop failures that could cause famine. Brother Thomas helped tend these gardens, working in all weather to plant, weed, and harvest the vegetables that supplemented the community's diet. The work was backbreaking during planting and harvest seasons, requiring long hours bent over growing plants. Pest control in medieval gardens relied on techniques that were often unpleasant, but necessary for crop survival. Brother Thomas helped collect insects by hand, removing caterpillars, beetles, and other pests that could destroy entire crops. He learned to identify beneficial insects that should be protected and harmful ones that required elimination. Garden fertilization required handling animal waste in large quantities. Brother Thomas helped spread aged manure across vegetable plots, working the organic matter into soil with primitive tools. The work was smelly and attracted clouds of flies during warm weather, but it was essential for maintaining soil fertility. Composting systems at medieval monasteries required careful management to prevent the spread of disease while maximizing the agricultural benefits of organic waste. Brother Thomas oversees multiple compost piles at various stages of decomposition, each requiring different maintenance schedules and techniques. The newest compost piles contain fresh kitchen scraps, animal waste, and human sewage that must be carefully layered with straw and turned regularly to ensure proper decomposition. The smell from these fresh piles is overwhelming, especially during summer months when the heat accelerates bacterial activity and attracts swarms of flies. Brother Thomas has learned to recognize the stages of decomposition by smell, texture, and temperature. Fresh compost generates considerable heat as bacteria break down organic matter, sometimes becoming hot enough to burn exposed skin. He tests pile temperatures by plunging his bare arm deep into the composting material, gauging readiness by the level of heat generated. The turning of compost piles is backbreaking work that must be done regardless of weather conditions. Using wooden pitchforks and shovels, Brother Thomas moves tons of decomposing organic matter, ensuring that materials at the bottom of piles are brought to the surface for proper aeration. The work releases clouds of dust and spores that irritate eyes and lungs. During winter months, compost piles freeze solid and must be broken apart with picks and crowbars before they can be turned. The frozen waste doesn't smell as strongly, but the physical labour is more demanding as Brother Thomas chips away at frozen masses of organic matter that have solidified into rock-hard chunks. Spring thaw brings its own challenges as frozen compost suddenly liquefies, creating muddy, foul-smelling streams that must be contained and redirected. Brother Thomas builds temporary dams and channels to prevent contaminated runoff from reaching the monastery's water supply or living areas. The monastery's laundry operations present another set of unpleasant challenges that fall partially under Brother Thomas's responsibilities. Medieval washing techniques relied on harsh lye solutions that could burn skin and caustic plant-based soaps that were barely effective against stubborn stains. Brother Thomas helps prepare washing solutions by mixing wood ash with water to create lye strong enough to break down grease and grime. The process requires careful timing because lye that's too weak won't clean effectively, while lye that's too strong will dissolve fabric along with the dirt. Washing the community's clothing and bedding is a multi-day process that begins with soaking heavily soiled items in cold water to loosen embedded dirt. Brother Thomas loads wooden tubs with dirty laundry, covers it with water, and leaves it to soak for days before the actual washing begins. The washing itself requires heating large quantities of water over wood fires, creating steamy, humid conditions that make the work exhausting. Brother Thomas stirs clothing in boiling lye solutions using wooden paddles, trying to clean fabric without destroying it in the caustic bath. Heavily stained items require additional treatment with primitive bleaching agents made from various plant materials. Brother Thomas applies these treatments by hand, rubbing caustic pastes into fabric while trying to protect his skin from chemical burns. The bleaching agents often fail to remove stains completely, leaving clothing permanently marked by the realities of medieval life. Rinsing requires multiple changes of clean water to remove all traces of lye and soap from washed items. Brother Thomas carries countless buckets of water from wells to washing areas, his back aching from the constant lifting and carrying. Inadequate rinsing leaves clothing stiff with chemical residues that irritate skin and cause rashes. Drying laundry during wet weather presents additional challenges. When outdoor drying isn't possible, wet clothing must be hung in enclosed spaces where it creates humid conditions perfect for mold growth. Brother Thomas regularly inspects drying laundry for signs of mildew and treats affected items with vinegar solutions to prevent permanent damage. The monastery's role as a centre of medical learning exposes Brother Thomas to procedures and treatments that would challenge modern medical professionals. He assists with anatomical studies that require dissecting human corpses, work that combines scientific inquiry with genuinely revolting practical realities. Medieval anatomical studies rely on bodies that are often in advanced states of decomposition by the time they become available for dissection. Brother Thomas helps prepare these bodies by removing clothing, cleaning away dirt and debris, and positioning corpses for examination by visiting scholars. The dissection process itself produces smells and sights that test even Brother Thomas's hardened constitution. Using primitive knives and tools, he helps open body cavities, remove organs for examination, and dispose of tissues that have served their educational purpose. The work must be completed quickly before further decomposition makes study impossible. Preservation of anatomical specimens requires techniques that are both crude and ineffective by modern standards. Brother Thomas helps pack organs in salt, submerge specimens in wine or vinegar solutions, and dry tissues for long-term storage. Many preservation attempts fail, leaving him to dispose of rotting specimens that have become too disgusting for further study. The monastery's scriptorium work extends beyond parchment preparation to include the creation of pigments and dyes used in illuminated manuscripts. Brother Thomas assists with grinding minerals, extracting colours from plants and insects, and mixing these materials into paints that will preserve medieval knowledge for future generations. Creating red pigment from cinnabar requires grinding mercury-containing minerals that release toxic vapours. Brother Thomas works with these dangerous materials using only primitive protection, breathing mercury fumes that accumulate in his body over years of exposure. The resulting pigment is beautiful, but the health cost is severe. Blue pigments extracted from lapis lazuli require grinding precious stones into powder fine enough for painting. The work is tedious and wasteful, as much of the expensive stone is lost during processing. Brother Thomas spends hours hunched over grinding stones, reducing valuable minerals to dust while inhaling particles that damage his lungs. Organic dyes extracted from plants often require fermentation processes that produce overwhelming odors. Brother Thomas tends vats of rotting plant matter, stirring the decomposing materials and straining out plant fibers to extract concentrated dyes. The fermentation produces gases that burn eyes and throats. Gold leaf application for manuscript decoration requires handling materials that are easily damaged by moisture or rough treatment. Brother Thomas learns to work with sheets of gold so thin they tear if handled carelessly, applying them to manuscript pages using techniques that require absolute steadiness and patience. The monastery's metalworking operations produce waste products that require careful handling and disposal. Brother Thomas helps manage slag from ironworking, disposing of toxic materials that could contaminate water supplies if handled improperly. The slag is heavy, sharp, and often hot enough to cause serious burns. Quenching hot metal in water or oil produces violent reactions that can splash molten materials onto exposed skin. Brother Thomas learns to work around forges while protecting himself from sparks and splashes, developing techniques for handling red-hot metal, safely using primitive tools and minimal protection. The grinding and sharpening of metal tools produces showers of sparks and metal filings that create fire hazards and respiratory problems. Brother Thomas works in poorly ventilated workshops where metal dust accumulates on every surface, including his lungs, causing coughing and breathing difficulties that worsen over time. Coal fires used in metalworking produce toxic fumes that fill workshops with choking smoke. Brother Thomas tends these fires for hours at a time, breathing coal smoke that blackens his lungs and shortens his lifespan. The work requires maintaining precise temperatures while enduring conditions that would violate every modern safety regulation. The monastery's carpentry operations require working with wood that's often green, warped, or infested with insects. Brother Thomas helps process timber by removing bark, splitting logs, and preparing boards for construction projects. The work involves handling heavy materials using primitive tools that increase the risk of serious injury. Seasoning wood for construction requires stacking lumber in specific patterns that allow air circulation while preventing warping. Brother Thomas builds and maintains these lumber piles, working in all weather conditions to ensure the monastery has properly dried wood for building projects. Wood finishing with primitive stains and preservatives exposes Brother Thomas to chemicals that would be banned in modern workshops. He applies these treatments by hand, often without gloves, allowing toxic materials to absorb through his skin and accumulate in his body over years of exposure. The monastery's glass-making operations, when they exist, require working with furnaces that reach temperatures hot enough to melt sand and other raw materials. Brother Thomas helps tend these furnaces, maintaining fires hot enough for glass production while protecting himself from intense heat and toxic fumes. Glass blowing requires working with the molten materials that can cause severe burns if handled improperly. Brother Thomas assists glass makers by preparing tools, maintaining furnace temperatures, and cleaning up after glass production sessions that leave workshops covered with sharp glass fragments and chemical residues. The monastery's pottery operations require preparing clay by removing stones, roots, and other debris that could cause finished pieces to crack or break. Brother Thomas processes clay by hand, kneading out impurities while working in conditions that coat everything with fine clay dust that irritates eyes and lungs. Firing pottery in primitive kilns requires maintaining precise temperatures for extended periods, while managing fires that produce considerable smoke and toxic fumes. Brother Thomas tends these fires through long nights, breathing smoke and ash, while monitoring kiln temperatures by observing flame colors and heat patterns. Glazing pottery involves working with lead-based materials that are highly toxic but necessary for creating waterproof surfaces. Brother Thomas applies these glazes by hand, allowing lead compounds to absorb through his skin and accumulate in his body, causing health problems that medieval medicine cannot understand or treat. The monastery's rope and cordage production requires processing plant fibers through techniques that are labor-intensive and often unpleasant. Brother Thomas helps prepare hemp and flax fibers by soaking plant materials in stagnant water until they rot enough to separate useful fibers from woody stems. The retting process, as this fiber separation is called, produces overwhelming smells as plant materials decompose in standing water. Brother Thomas tends these retting ponds for weeks, stirring rotting plant matter and testing fiber readiness by pulling apart decomposing stems with his bare hands. Spinning processed fibers into rope requires working with materials that are rough enough to cut unprotected hands. Brother Thomas operates primitive spinning equipment that twists fibers into cordage while trying to avoid injuries from sharp plant fibers and moving machinery parts. The monastery's beekeeping operations require managing insect colonies that can become aggressive without warning. Brother Thomas helps maintain beehives by inspecting colonies, harvesting honey, and managing swarm behavior, using techniques that rely more on courage than protection. Medieval beekeeping lacks the protective equipment that modern apiarists take for granted. Brother Thomas works with angry bees, using only smoke to calm them, accepting bee stings as an inevitable part of honey production. Multiple stings can cause serious allergic reactions that medieval medicine cannot treat effectively. Honey extraction requires destroying portions of beehives to access honey stores, a process that infuriates the bees and makes the work dangerous. Brother Thomas cuts honeycombs from hives while dealing with swarms of angry insects that attack anyone who threatens their colony. Wax processing requires melting honeycomb materials to separate wax from honey residues. The process produces hot wax that can cause severe burns if spilled on skin, and Brother Thomas works with these materials using primitive equipment that offers little protection from accidents. The monastery's fish farming operations require managing ponds that can become contaminated with diseases that kill entire fish populations. Brother Thomas helps maintain these ponds by removing dead fish before they can spread disease, working in muddy water that often contains decomposing organic matter. Fish harvesting requires working in cold water for extended periods, while handling slippery, struggling fish that can inflict cuts with sharp fins and teeth. Brother Thomas helps net fish for harvest, often working waist-deep in frigid pond water during winter months. Processing harvested fish for preservation requires gutting and cleaning hundreds of fish quickly before they spoil. Brother Thomas works at cleaning stations where fish waste accumulates rapidly, creating slippery, smelly conditions that attract flies and scavengers. Salt curing of fish requires packing cleaned fish in salt and monitoring the curing process to prevent spoilage. Brother Thomas manages these salt curing operations, turning fish regularly and replacing salt that becomes contaminated with fish fluids. The work leaves his hands permanently stained and damaged by constant exposure to salt. The monastery's herb garden operations require knowledge of plants that can be dangerous to handle or process. Brother Thomas helps cultivate medicinal herbs, some of which are toxic enough to cause serious illness if handled improperly or consumed accidentally. Harvesting medicinal herbs requires working with plants at specific times of day or year when their active compounds are most concentrated. Brother Thomas learns to recognize these optimal harvesting conditions while protecting himself from plants that can cause skin reactions or respiratory problems. Processing herbs for medicinal use requires drying, grinding, and extracting active compounds, using techniques that expose workers to concentrated plant chemicals. Brother Thomas operates primitive distillation equipment, breathing vapors from boiling plant materials that can cause headaches, nausea, and other health problems. Storing processed herbs requires protecting them from moisture, insects, and rodents that can contaminate medicinal supplies. Brother Thomas maintains herb storage areas by monitoring for pest infestations and replacing materials that have been damaged by humidity or vermin. The monastery's wine production operations require managing fermentation processes that can go wrong in spectacular and messy ways. Brother Thomas helps maintain wine cellars where grape juice slowly transforms into alcohol under conditions that must be carefully controlled to prevent contamination. Grape crushing for wine production is messy work that stains everything with purple juice that attracts insects and creates sticky conditions underfoot. Brother Thomas helps operate primitive wine presses, working with grape pulp that ferments rapidly in warm weather and produces alcoholic vapors that can cause intoxication through inhalation. Wine aging requires monitoring fermentation progress while preventing contamination that could ruin entire batches of wine. Brother Thomas helps maintain wine barrels, cleaning them between uses and testing wine quality by taste and smell. Contaminated wine produces odors and flavors that are unmistakably foul. Vinegar production from wine that has spoiled beyond drinking requires managing acetic fermentation that produces strong acidic vapors. Brother Thomas tends vinegar operations in poorly ventilated spaces where acetic acid fumes burn eyes and throats, while slowly corroding metal tools and equipment. The monastery's cheese-making operations require handling milk products that spoil quickly in warm weather. Brother Thomas helps process milk into cheese using techniques that rely on bacterial fermentation to transform liquid milk into solid cheese, while preventing harmful bacteria from contaminating the product. Cheese aging requires maintaining proper humidity and temperature conditions in storage areas where cheese develops the flavors and textures that make it palatable. Brother Thomas monitors these aging areas, turning cheese wheels regularly and removing any that show signs of harmful mold growth. Waste disposal from cheese making creates waste products that must be managed carefully to prevent attracting pests or creating health hazards. Brother Thomas helps dispose of whey by feeding it to pigs or using it as fertilizer, working with materials that smell strongly of sour milk. The monastery's soap-making operations require handling caustic lye solutions that can cause severe chemical burns. Brother Thomas helps prepare lye from wood ashes, testing solution strength using techniques that require direct contact with materials that can damage skin and eyes. Fat rendering for soap production requires heating animal fat until it melts, a process that produces overwhelming odors and toxic smoke. Brother Thomas tends rendering operations, stirring melted fat while breathing fumes that cause nausea and headaches. Soap curing requires allowing finished soap to age until it becomes mild enough for safe use. Brother Thomas monitors aging soap, testing batches for safety while working with materials that remain caustic enough to cause chemical burns for weeks after production. The seasonal nature of monastic work means that Brother Thomas faces different challenges throughout the year, with each season bringing its own set of unpleasant tasks. Spring planting requires working in muddy fields, where seeds must be planted by hand in soil that's often waterlogged and difficult to work. Summer brings intense heat that makes all outdoor work exhausting, while increasing the smell and pest problems associated with waste management and food processing. Brother Thomas works longer hours during summer months while dealing with flies, heat, and the accelerated decomposition of organic materials. Autumn harvest time requires processing large quantities of crops quickly before they spoil, creating intense work periods where Brother Thomas labors from dawn to dusk, handling grains, fruits, and vegetables that must be processed immediately after harvest. Winter brings its own challenges, as cold weather makes all work more difficult, while increasing the risk of accidents and injuries. Brother Thomas works in freezing conditions that numb hands and feet while making tools slippery and dangerous to handle. Despite the harsh realities of his daily work, Brother Thomas finds meaning in labor that serves his religious community and supports the monastery's mission of prayer, learning, and service. His work, though unglamorous and often disgusting, makes possible the scholarly and spiritual achievements that define monastic life. The bells continue to ring throughout each day, marking the hours for prayer and reminding Brother Thomas that even the most menial labor can be a form of worship when performed with proper intention. As he scrubs, cleans, and disposes of the waste products of medieval life, he participates in the larger rhythm of monastic existence that has sustained European civilization through its darkest periods. Tomorrow will bring the same routine, the same unpleasant tasks, and the same quiet satisfaction that comes from essential work well done. Brother Thomas will rise again before dawn, answer the bell for matins, and begin another day of labour that most people would find unbearable, but that he has learned to accept as his contribution to the larger purposes of his community. The monastery's illuminated manuscript workshop holds secrets that would astonish most visitors who admire the finished products. While scholars marvel at the intricate gold leaf decorations and vibrant colours that adorn sacred texts, they rarely consider the revolting processes required to create these masterpieces. Brother Thomas has become intimately familiar with every nauseating step. Creating the perfect writing surface begins with selecting animal skins, but not just any animals will do. Calfskin produces the finest parchment, but obtaining it requires slaughtering very young calves whose hides are still tender. Brother Thomas assists with this grim task, holding down frightened animals while the monastery's butcher performs the killing. The screaming of dying calves echoes through the slaughterhouse, a sound that haunts even experienced monks. Once the animals are dead, their skins must be removed while still warm to prevent the hide from adhering too tightly to the underlying flesh. Brother Thomas works quickly with sharp knives, peeling away skin that's still bloody and warm to the touch. The work requires precision because any cuts or tears in the hide will ruin the finished parchment. The raw skins are immediately plunged into vats of cold water to remove blood and begin the cleaning process. This initial washing creates pools of pink-tinged water that must be changed repeatedly as blood continues to leach from the hides. Brother Thomas hauls bucket after bucket of bloody water away from the workshop, his robe stained permanently with the evidence of his work. After the initial cleaning, skins are transferred to lime pits, where they soak for weeks in caustic solutions that dissolve remaining flesh and hair. The lime solution is strong enough to burn exposed skin and produces vapors that make eyes water and throats burn. Brother Thomas tends these pits daily, stirring the skins and testing the lime's strength by plunging his bare arm into the caustic bath. The smell from lime pits is indescribable, a combination of rotting flesh, caustic chemicals, and decomposing hair that permeates everything within 100 yards. Visitors to the monastery can always identify the parchment workshop by the overwhelming stench that clings to anyone who works there. When the lime has done its work, skins are removed and stretched on wooden frames where they're scraped clean, using curved knives called lunellums. Brother Thomas spends hours hunched over these frames, scraping away every trace of flesh, fat, and hair, while the wet skin fights back against his efforts. The scraping motion is repetitive and brutal on the back and arms. The scraping process produces piles of putrid flesh and hair that must be disposed of quickly before they attract scavengers. Brother Thomas loads wheelbarrows with this organic waste, hauling it to compost pits where it will slowly decompose into fertilizer. The smell of decomposing flesh follows him everywhere, embedded so deeply in his clothing that no amount of washing can remove it. Once scraped clean, the skins are left to dry while still stretched on their frames. This drying process can take weeks, during which the skins must be protected from flies that would otherwise lay eggs in any remaining organic matter. Brother Thomas covers each frame with cloth barriers, while maintaining constant vigilance against insect infestations. Dried skins are then sanded smooth, using abrasive stones that remove any remaining imperfections. This sanding work fills the air with fine particles of animal skin that irritate lungs and coat everything with a layer of organic dust. Brother Thomas works wearing cloth over his mouth and nose, but the primitive protection does little to prevent inhalation of skin particles. The final step in parchment preparation involves treating the surface with chalk powder to create the ideal writing surface. This chalk must be ground by hand to achieve the proper fineness, work that leaves Brother Thomas's hands white with dust and his lungs burning from inhaled particles. Even with all this preparation, many skins prove unsuitable for manuscript work, due to flaws that only become apparent during the writing process. Brother Thomas has learned to identify these defective skins early, saving countless hours of wasted effort by recognizing problems before scribes begin their work. The creation of writing inks presents its own catalogue of disgusting processes. Black ink, the most commonly used colour, is made from oak galls that must be collected from infected oak trees. These galls are actually tumours created by wasp larvae, and harvesting them requires cutting open swollen growths to extract the larvae-filled centres. Brother Thomas climbs oak trees to collect these galls, cutting into bark tumours that often explode with a shower of larvae and infected tree sap. The larvae are still alive when collected, writhing in their gall prisons until they're crushed during the ink-making process. The sight of hundreds of squirming wasp larvae being ground into powder is enough to turn the strongest stomach. The collected galls must be crushed into fine powder using heavy stone mortars. This grinding work releases clouds of acidic dust that burns exposed skin and eyes. Brother Thomas pounds away at the galls for hours, reducing them to powder while breathing the caustic particles that will eventually damage his lungs permanently. Iron sulfate, the other main ingredient in black ink, must be prepared by dissolving iron filings in sulfuric acid solutions. This process produces toxic vapours that can kill if inhaled in sufficient quantities. Brother Thomas works with these materials in poorly ventilated spaces, slowly poisoning himself with chemical fumes that medieval medicine cannot understand or treat. Mixing the finished ink requires combining the gall powder with iron sulfate solutions and various binding agents. The chemical reaction between these ingredients produces more toxic fumes while creating an ink that's acidic enough to eat through parchment if not properly formulated. Brother Thomas tests ink acidity by applying drops to scraps of parchment and observing how quickly the acid burns through the writing surface. Red ink production requires grinding cinnabar, a mercury-containing mineral that releases toxic vapors during processing. Brother Thomas operates primitive grinding equipment that pulverizes cinnabar into fine powder while allowing mercury vapor to escape into the workshop air. Prolonged exposure to these mercury vapors causes neurological damage that manifests as tremors, memory loss, and eventually madness. The grinding of cinnabar must be done slowly to prevent overheating that would vaporize too much mercury at once. Brother Thomas works for days to produce small quantities of red pigment, breathing mercury vapor throughout the process, while trying to achieve the perfect color and consistency demanded by the monastery's scribes. Blue ink requires grinding lapis lazuli, an expensive stone imported from distant lands at great cost. The grinding process wastes much of this precious material as stone chips fly away during pulverization. Brother Thomas works with tools that are barely adequate for the task, struggling to reduce hard stone to fine powder without losing too much material to waste. The lapis lazuli dust produced during grinding is so fine it remains suspended in air for hours after processing ends. Brother Thomas breathes this stone dust throughout his work, allowing mineral particles to accumulate in his lungs where they cause permanent damage. The beautiful blue ink created from this process comes at the cost of the worker's respiratory health. Gold ink requires dissolving gold leaf in mercury to create an amalgam that can be applied to parchment. This process exposes Brother Thomas to both gold and mercury vapors that are absorbed through his skin and lungs. The mercury slowly accumulates in his body, causing subtle neurological symptoms that worsen over years of exposure. The monastery's bookbinding operations require working with materials and processes that are equally unpleasant. Book covers are made from wooden boards that must be prepared by hand using primitive tools. Brother Thomas shapes these boards using draw knives and planes, working with green wood that splits unpredictably and can cause serious injuries. Covering the wooden boards requires preparing leather that's been tanned, using traditional methods that rely on animal urine and brain matter. The tanning process produces leather that retains odors and chemical residues that make it unpleasant to handle. Brother Thomas works with this leather using bare hands that absorb the chemicals and develop permanent stains and texture changes. Book clasps and hinges are made from iron that must be forged by hand using primitive blacksmithing techniques. Brother Thomas helps operate the forge bellows, maintaining fires hot enough to work iron, while breathing smoke and metal fumes that damage his respiratory system. The forging work is dangerous, with sparks and hot metal fragments that can cause serious burns. Thread used for sewing book signatures is made from animal sinews that must be prepared by removing tendons from slaughtered animals. Brother Thomas helps extract these sinews, working with carcasses that are often partially decomposed by the time the tendons are removed. The sinews must then be dried, twisted into thread, and treated with preservatives that prevent decay. The sewing process itself requires piercing parchment with bone needles that are made from animal bones shaped by hand. Brother Thomas prepares these needles by selecting appropriate bones, carving them to proper shape, and polishing them smooth enough for use. The bone dust produced during this work irritates his respiratory system and coats his hands with organic particles. Glue used in bookbinding is made from animal bones, hooves, and hides that are boiled for hours to extract gelatin. This process produces overwhelming odors that permeate the entire workshop while creating a sticky, smelly glue that's difficult to work with. Brother Thomas tends the glue pots, stirring the boiling mixture while breathing vapors that make him nauseous. The monastery's copying work exposes Brother Thomas to additional health hazards from the materials used by scribes. Quill pens are made from goose feathers that must be prepared by removing the natural oils and reshaping the tips for writing. This preparation involves heating the quills in hot sand, a process that produces smoke and odors that irritate eyes and lungs. Preparing writing desks requires maintaining proper angles and lighting conditions for scribes who spend long hours copying manuscripts. Brother Thomas adjusts desk heights, maintains oil lamps that provide light, and ensures that writing surfaces remain clean and free from ink stains. The oil lamps produce smoke and soot that accumulate in the scriptorium, creating air quality problems that affect everyone who works there. Erasure of mistakes requires using pumice stones or knife blades to scrape away unwanted text. This process produces parchment dust that becomes airborne and irritates respiratory systems. Brother Thomas helps prepare erasure tools and cleans up the parchment particles that result from correction work. The monastery's role as a centre of learning brings additional challenges, as Brother Thomas must help maintain the library where precious manuscripts are stored. Medieval books are vulnerable to insects, rodents, and moisture that can destroy centuries of accumulated knowledge. Protecting these books requires constant vigilance and intervention using techniques that are often unpleasant. Insect infestations in books require fumigation using toxic herbs and chemicals that can be dangerous to humans as well as insects. Brother Thomas seals library rooms and burns fumigants that produce poisonous smoke designed to kill book-eating insects. The fumigation process requires him to enter sealed rooms filled with toxic vapors to check on the effectiveness of the treatment. Rodent control in libraries requires setting traps and removing dead animals that can decompose and damage books through their decay. Brother Thomas checks these traps regularly, disposing of decomposing rodent carcasses while trying to prevent the spread of diseases that these animals might carry. Moisture control requires maintaining proper ventilation and humidity levels that prevent mold growth, without allowing books to become too dry and brittle. Brother Thomas monitors these conditions by observing mold growth patterns and adjusting ventilation systems that often require working in cramped spaces beneath library floors. Book repair requires working with manuscripts that have been damaged by age, insects, or handling. Brother Thomas helps mend torn parchment using techniques that involve applying patches and reinforcements to damaged areas. This work requires handling books that are often contaminated with mold spores and insect waste that can cause respiratory problems. The monastery's educational mission requires Brother Thomas to help maintain classrooms and study areas where visiting scholars conduct their research. These spaces accumulate considerable waste from the scholarly activities conducted there, requiring constant cleaning and maintenance to remain functional. Ink spills and writing accidents create permanent stains that must be treated using harsh cleaning agents that can damage surfaces while removing the unwanted marks. Brother Thomas scrubs these stains using lye solutions and abrasive materials that burn his hands while slowly eating away at wooden surfaces. Candle wax from reading lamps accumulates on desks and floors, creating slip hazards and fire risks that must be regularly removed. Brother Thomas scrapes away hardened wax using metal tools that can damage furniture while trying to remove every trace of the fire hazard. The monastery's guest accommodations for visiting scholars require special attention because these visitors often arrive carrying diseases and parasites from their travels. Brother Thomas must clean and disinfect guest rooms between visitors, using techniques that expose him to whatever illnesses the previous occupants might have carried. Bedding from guest rooms must be thoroughly cleaned and aired before being used by the next visitor. Brother Thomas handles linens that may be contaminated with lice, fleas, or disease organisms, washing them in solutions hot enough to kill parasites while trying to protect himself from infection. Personal items left behind by departing scholars must be cleaned and stored, but these items often carry infestations that can spread throughout the monastery if not properly handled. Brother Thomas sorts through abandoned belongings, identifying items that must be destroyed due to contamination, while salvaging anything that can be safely reused. The monastery's role as a medical centre exposes Brother Thomas to diseases and conditions that would challenge modern healthcare workers. He assists with treating patients who arrive with wounds, infections, and illnesses that require handling contaminated materials and bodily fluids. Surgical procedures, when they are attempted, produce considerable blood loss that must be managed using primitive techniques. Brother Thomas helps control bleeding by applying pressure to wounds while assisting surgeons who work without anesthesia on conscious patients. The screaming of surgical patients during procedures is traumatic for everyone involved. Wound cleaning requires removing infected tissue and foreign objects from injuries that are often badly contaminated. Brother Thomas helps clean wounds using wine or vinegar as antiseptics, scrubbing infected areas while trying to prevent the spread of infection to other patients. Amputation procedures require removing diseased limbs quickly before gangrene spreads throughout the body. Brother Thomas helps restrain patients during these procedures while assisting with the removal and disposal of amputated limbs. The sight and smell of gangrenous tissue being cut away is nauseating even for experienced medical workers. Post-surgical care requires monitoring patients for signs of infection while changing bandages that become soaked with blood and pus. Brother Thomas learns to recognize the signs of surgical infections, removing contaminated dressings and applying fresh bandages while trying to prevent cross-contamination between patients. The disposal of medical waste requires burning contaminated materials or burying them in locations where they won't contaminate water supplies. Brother Thomas maintains medical waste disposal sites, ensuring that diseased tissues and contaminated bandages are properly destroyed to prevent the spread of illness. Patient care during epidemic outbreaks requires isolating infected individuals while providing basic medical support. Brother Thomas helps maintain quarantine areas where plague victims and other infectious patients are separated from the general population. The work requires constant exposure to deadly diseases while using only primitive protective measures. Body disposal during epidemic periods requires removing the dead quickly before their corpses can spread disease further. Brother Thomas helps carry plague victims to burial sites, handling decomposing bodies that are highly infectious. The work must be done quickly despite the risk of infection. Mass grave preparation during severe epidemics requires digging burial sites large enough to accommodate multiple victims. Brother Thomas helps excavate these graves, working in conditions where the smell of decomposing bodies makes the labour almost unbearable. The graves must be deep enough to prevent scavengers from disturbing the dead. Disinfection of areas used by plague victims requires fumigating rooms with burning herbs and chemicals that produce toxic smoke. Brother Thomas enters contaminated areas wearing only cloth masks, breathing poisonous fumes while trying to kill disease organisms that might infect future occupants. The monastery's agricultural operations extend beyond basic farming to include specialized crops that require particularly unpleasant processing techniques. Flax cultivation for linen production requires retting processes that rot plant stems in stagnant water until fibers can be separated from woody material. Brother Thomas tends flax retting pools where plant materials decompose for weeks in stagnant water that becomes increasingly foul as decomposition progresses. The smell from these pools is overwhelming, a combination of rotting vegetation and stagnant water that can be detected from considerable distances. The separation of flax fibers requires beating the rotted plants with wooden tools to break apart the decomposed stems. This work releases clouds of organic dust and plant particles that irritate respiratory systems. Brother Thomas performs this beating work for hours, breathing decomposed plant matter while trying to separate usable fibers from waste material. Hemp cultivation requires similar processing techniques, but produces even stronger odors during the retting process. Brother Thomas works with hemp plants that have been soaking in stagnant pools until they reach the proper state of decomposition for fiber extraction. The smell of rotting hemp is particularly nauseating and seems to penetrate clothing and skin permanently. Dye plant cultivation requires growing and processing plants that are often toxic or irritating to handle. Brother Thomas helps harvest madder roots for red dye, working with plants that stain everything they touch while causing skin reactions in sensitive individuals. The processing of these plants requires grinding roots into powder that creates clouds of irritating dust. Woad cultivation for blue dye requires fermenting plant leaves in conditions that produce overwhelming odors and toxic gases. Brother Thomas tends woad fermentation vats where plant material decomposes under controlled conditions designed to concentrate the blue dye compounds. The fermentation produces gases that can cause unconsciousness if inhaled in sufficient quantities. The monastery's textile operations require processing raw materials through techniques that expose workers to a variety of health hazards. Wool processing begins with washing fleeces in solutions of stale urine that has been collected and aged specifically for this purpose. Brother Thomas helps collect and age urine for wool washing, maintaining containers of decomposing human waste that will eventually be used to clean raw wool. The aged urine develops an ammonia content that's effective for removing lanolin from wool fibers, but the smell is indescribable and permeates everything in the textile workshop. Wool washing requires trampling fleeces in vats of aged urine, while the caustic solution removes oils and dirt from the fibers. Brother Thomas performs this trampling work, standing for hours in urine solutions that burn his feet and legs, while breathing ammonia vapors that damage his respiratory system. The fulling of woven cloth requires pounding fabric in solutions of clay and urine until the fibers mat together into waterproof material. Brother Thomas operates fulling hammers that pound cloth for hours while he breathes the vapors from fermenting urine and clay mixtures. The work is exhausting and exposes him to caustic chemicals that cause skin damage. Cloth dyeing requires working with materials that are often toxic or corrosive. Brother Thomas helps prepare dye baths using plant materials, minerals, and mordants that fix colors permanently in fabric fibers. Many of these materials cause skin reactions or respiratory problems with prolonged exposure. The mordanting process requires treating fabric with metallic salts that help dyes bond permanently with fibers. Brother Thomas works with solutions containing iron, copper, and tin compounds that are toxic if absorbed through skin or inhaled as vapors. The metallic solutions stain his hands permanently and accumulate in his body over years of exposure. Heat setting of dyed fabrics requires maintaining precise temperatures in dye baths while handling hot, wet cloth that can cause severe burns. Brother Thomas monitors dye bath temperatures by testing the water with his bare hands, gauging heat levels that could cause serious injury if misjudged. The monastery's leather working operations require processing animal hides through techniques that produce overwhelming odors and expose workers to toxic chemicals. Leather tanning begins with removing hair from fresh hides using lime solutions that are caustic enough to dissolve organic matter. Brother Thomas helps prepare tanning solutions by mixing lime with water to create baths strong enough to remove hair from animal hides. The lime solutions produce caustic vapors that burn exposed skin and damage respiratory systems. Working with these materials requires constant contact with chemicals that cause permanent skin damage. Hair removal from hides requires scraping away dissolved hair and flesh using curved knives while the hides are still soaked with caustic lime solutions. Brother Thomas performs this scraping work while lime solution drips from the hides onto his hands and arms, causing chemical burns that heal slowly and leave permanent scars. The actual tanning process requires soaking dehaired hides in solutions of ground oak bark that contain tannins needed to transform animal skin into leather. These bark solutions must be prepared by grinding oak bark into powder, work that fills the air with organic dust that irritates eyes and lungs. Tanning pits must be maintained by stirring hides regularly and replacing bark solutions as they become depleted. Brother Thomas works in these pits, handling hides that are soaking in solutions that stain everything they touch while producing odors that permeate clothing and skin. Brain tanning, used for producing the softest leather, requires working with animal brains that have been preserved in salt solutions. Brother Thomas helps prepare these brain solutions by removing brains from slaughtered animals and processing them into pastes that can be worked into leather. The work requires handling decomposing brain matter that produces nauseating odors. The application of brain solutions to leather requires rubbing the organic paste into hide surfaces by hand. Brother Thomas performs this work wearing no protective equipment, allowing brain matter and preserving chemicals to absorb through his skin, while breathing the organic vapors produced by decomposing neural tissue. Leather finishing requires treating tanned hides with oils and waxes that protect the finished product from water damage. Brother Thomas applies these treatments by hand, working with materials that penetrate his skin and accumulate in his body over time. The finishing oils often become rancid, producing odors that are particularly offensive during warm weather. The monastery's candle-making operations require rendering animal fat into tallow suitable for candle production. This rendering process involves heating animal fat until it melts, while trying to remove impurities that would affect candle quality. Brother Thomas helps collect fat from slaughtered animals, working with materials that spoil rapidly in warm weather and attract swarms of flies. The fat must be processed quickly before it becomes too rancid to use, requiring long hours of work during slaughter seasons. The rendering process requires heating fat in large cauldrons while stirring constantly to prevent burning that would ruin the entire batch. Brother Thomas tends these rendering fires, breathing smoke and vapors from melting fat while trying to maintain proper temperatures for tallow production. Straining rendered tallow requires removing bits of meat and other impurities that would create smoking problems in finished candles. Brother Thomas filters hot tallow through cloth strainers, working with materials hot enough to cause severe burns while trying to achieve the purity needed for quality candles. Wick preparation requires twisting plant fibers into cords that will burn properly in finished candles. Brother Thomas prepares these wicks by hand, working with fibers that must be treated with salt solutions to ensure proper burning characteristics. The salt treatment requires soaking wicks in brine solutions that leave his hands permanently damaged by salt exposure. Candle molding requires dipping prepared wicks repeatedly in hot tallow until sufficient layers build up to form finished candles. Brother Thomas performs this dipping work, handling hot tallow that can cause severe burns, while trying to achieve uniform thickness in the finished products. The cooling and storage of finished candles requires protecting them from heat, that would cause melting and from insects that are attracted to the animal fat used in their production. Brother Thomas maintains candle storage areas, monitoring for pest infestations and temperature conditions that could damage the finished products. As evening approaches and the monastery settles into its nighttime routine, Brother Thomas completes his final tasks of the day. The work never truly ends, but darkness brings a temporary respite from the most demanding labours. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same unpleasant realities, and the same quiet satisfaction that comes from essential work performed without complaint. The bells will ring again before dawn, calling the community to prayer and marking the beginning of another day of labour that few outsiders could imagine or endure. Brother Thomas will rise, as he has for 12 years, ready to face whatever disgusting task awaits him in service to his religious community and the larger purposes it serves. The monastery's brewing operations demand Brother Thomas's attention throughout the changing seasons, each bringing its own set of revolting challenges that would horrify modern brewers. Medieval beer production wasn't the clean scientific process we know today. It was a constant battle against contamination, spoilage, and the organic realities of fermentation gone wrong. During harvest season, Brother Thomas helps process the grains that will become the monastery's primary beverage. Barley must be malted by soaking it in water until it begins to sprout, then drying it over fires that fill the malting house with choking smoke. The sprouting grain attracts rodents and insects that contaminate the supply, requiring constant vigilance to prevent infestations that could ruin entire batches. The malting process produces grain dust that coats everything in the brewery with a fine layer of organic particles. Brother Thomas breathes this dust throughout his work, feeling it settle in his lungs while his eyes water from the constant irritation. The sprouted barley must be turned regularly by hand, work that leaves him covered in grain particles that work their way into his clothing and skin. Grinding malted barley requires operating primitive mills that crush grain between heavy stones. Brother Thomas feeds grain into these mills while trying to avoid getting his fingers caught in the grinding mechanism. The stone mills produce clouds of flour dust that make breathing difficult while coating every surface with a layer of organic powder that attracts pests. The brewing process itself takes place in wooden vats that are impossible to sterilize using medieval techniques. Brother Thomas scrubs these vats with sand and lye solutions, trying to remove the accumulated residues from previous batches, while knowing that complete cleanliness is impossible to achieve. The wooden surfaces harbor bacteria that can contaminate new batches despite his best cleaning efforts. Boiling wort in large copper kettles requires maintaining fires hot enough to bring massive quantities of liquid to a rolling boil. Brother Thomas tends these fires for hours, breathing smoke and steam while trying to prevent the wort from boiling over and creating sticky messes that attract insects. The boiling process fills the brewery with humid, smoky air that makes the work exhausting. Hops used to flavour the beer must be harvested at precisely the right time and dried quickly to preserve their bittering compounds. Brother Thomas helps harvest hop flowers by hand, working in hop gardens where the plants grow tall enough to require ladders for complete harvesting. The hop flowers produce resins that stain his hands and cause skin reactions in sensitive individuals. Drying harvested hops requires spreading them on screens in well-ventilated areas where they can lose moisture without developing mold. Brother Thomas monitors these drying operations, turning the hops regularly while trying to prevent spoilage that would ruin the entire harvest. The drying hops produce aromatic compounds that can cause headaches and respiratory irritation with prolonged exposure. The fermentation process presents the greatest challenges in medieval brewing. Without understanding of yeast biology, Brother Thomas relies on wild yeasts present in the environment to convert sugars into alcohol. These wild yeasts are unpredictable and often produce off flavors or fail to ferment properly, resulting in batches that must be discarded. Fermentation vessels must be monitored constantly for signs of problems that could ruin entire batches of beer. Brother Thomas learns to recognize the sounds, smells, and visual cues that indicate proper fermentation versus contamination or failure. Contaminated batches produce foul odors and flavors that make the beer undrinkable. When fermentation goes wrong, the cleanup is spectacular and disgusting. Contaminated beer can produce gases that cause wooden barrels to explode, spraying fermenting liquid across the brewery walls and ceiling. Brother Thomas cleans up these disasters, scrubbing sticky alcoholic residues from surfaces while breathing the toxic fumes produced by spoiled grain. The storage of finished beer requires maintaining proper conditions in cellars that are cool enough to prevent spoilage, but not so cold that the beer freezes and bursts its containers. Brother Thomas monitors these storage areas, checking barrel temperatures by touch while trying to prevent the pest infestations that are attracted to the organic materials. Beer barrels require constant maintenance to prevent leaks that could result in significant losses of precious beverage. Brother Thomas repairs barrel staves and hoops using primitive tools while working with wood that has been soaked with beer and often contaminated with mold or bacteria. The repair work requires handling materials that are sticky, smelly, and often slippery from accumulated organic residues. Cleaning beer barrels between uses requires scrubbing the interior surfaces with brushes made from animal hair. Brother Thomas works inside these barrels, scraping away accumulated deposits while breathing the concentrated alcoholic fumes that can cause intoxication or unconsciousness in poorly ventilated spaces. The barrel interiors are dark, cramped, and filled with organic residues that resist cleaning efforts. The monastery's blacksmith operations expose Brother Thomas to some of the most dangerous working conditions in the entire complex. The forge produces temperatures hot enough to melt iron while filling the workshop with toxic smoke and metal fumes that damage respiratory systems over time. Coal fires used in metalworking produce intense heat while releasing sulfur compounds and other toxic gases. Brother Thomas tends these fires throughout long working sessions, breathing smoke that blackens his lungs while trying to maintain the precise temperatures needed for different metalworking tasks. The coal smoke contains particles that accumulate in his respiratory system over years of exposure. Iron ore must be smelted in furnaces that reach temperatures capable of separating metal from rock. Brother Thomas helps operate these furnaces, working in conditions where the radiant heat is intense enough to cause burns from several feet away. The smelting process produces slag and other waste products that must be removed while still hot enough to cause severe injuries. Forging iron into tools requires hammering red-hot metal while it's malleable enough to shape. Brother Thomas operates the forge bellows that maintain proper fire temperatures while trying to avoid the sparks and metal fragments that fly from the anvil during hammering. The work requires precise timing and coordination between the smith and his assistant. The quenching of hot iron in water or oil produces violent reactions that can splash molten materials onto exposed skin. Brother Thomas learns to anticipate these reactions while positioning quenching baths and tools needed for the cooling process. The sudden cooling of hot metal produces steam and vapors that can cause serious burns if inhaled. Tool maintenance requires sharpening and repairing implements that have been damaged through use. Brother Thomas operates grinding wheels that produce showers of sparks and metal particles while trying to restore proper cutting edges to worn tools. The grinding work requires holding tools at precise angles while avoiding injury from the spinning abrasive wheels. The monastery's pottery operations require working with clay materials that must be processed through techniques exposing workers to silica dust and other respiratory hazards. Clay preparation begins with digging raw materials from deposits that often contain harmful impurities, requiring removal before the clay can be used. Brother Thomas helps process raw clay by removing stones, roots, and other debris that could cause finished pottery to crack or break during firing. This sorting work requires handling clay materials that coat his hands and clothing with fine particles that become airborne and irritate respiratory systems. Preparing clay for pottery requires mixing raw materials with water and additives that improve workability and firing characteristics. Brother Thomas operates primitive mixing equipment that produces clouds of clay dust while trying to achieve uniform consistency in the prepared materials. The mixing work is physically demanding and exposes him to silica particles that accumulate in his lungs. The pottery wheel requires maintaining proper moisture levels in clay while shaping vessels that must meet specific requirements for monastery use. Brother Thomas helps prepare clay for wheel throwing while learning to recognize the consistency needed for different types of pottery. The work requires constant contact with wet clay that removes natural oils from skin. Kiln firing of pottery requires maintaining precise temperatures for extended periods while managing fires that produce considerable smoke and toxic fumes. Brother Thomas tends kiln fires through long nights, breathing combustion products while monitoring temperature conditions that determine the success or failure of entire pottery batches. Glazing pottery involves working with lead-based materials that are highly toxic but necessary for creating waterproof surfaces on finished vessels. Brother Thomas applies these glazes by hand, allowing lead compounds to absorb through his skin while breathing vapors that cause neurological damage over time. The monastery's rope and cordage production requires processing plant fibers through techniques that are labor-intensive and expose workers to organic dusts and chemical treatments. Hemp and flax cultivation provides raw materials that must be processed through retting and breaking operations that produce overwhelming odors. Retting operations require soaking plant stems in stagnant water until bacterial action separates useful fibers from woody material. Brother Thomas tends these retting ponds, where decomposing plant matter produces gases and odors that can be detected from considerable distances. The decomposition process attracts insects and creates ideal breeding conditions for disease-carrying organisms. Breaking processed plant stems requires using wooden tools to crush woody portions, while preserving the long fibers needed for rope production. Brother Thomas operates these breaking tools, working with plant materials that produce clouds of organic dust, while trying to separate fibers efficiently without excessive waste. Spinning plant fibers into cordage requires operating primitive equipment that twists individual fibers into continuous strands. Brother Thomas helps operate spinning wheels while trying to maintain consistent tension and thickness in the finished rope. The work requires handling rough plant fibers that can cause cuts and abrasions on unprotected hands. Rope finishing requires treating completed cordage with preservatives that prevent decay and pest damage. Brother Thomas applies these treatments by hand, working with tar and other materials that penetrate skin and cause permanent staining. The preservative treatments often contain toxic compounds that accumulate in his body over years of exposure. The monastery's fish preservation operations require processing large quantities of fish through techniques designed to prevent spoilage in an era without refrigeration. Salt curing, smoking, and drying all present challenges that expose workers to unpleasant conditions and health hazards. Fish cleaning requires gutting and preparing fresh fish quickly before bacterial action begins spoilage processes. Brother Thomas works at cleaning stations where fish waste accumulates rapidly, creating slippery conditions while attracting flies and other scavengers. The work must be completed quickly despite the unpleasant working conditions. Salt curing requires packing cleaned fish in salt while monitoring the curing process to ensure proper preservation. Brother Thomas manages salt curing operations, turning fish regularly and replacing salt that becomes contaminated with fish fluids. The salt draws moisture from his hands, causing permanent damage to skin that becomes cracked and painful. Smoking operations require maintaining fires that produce dense smoke while preventing temperatures from becoming hot enough to cook the fish rather than preserve it. Brother Thomas tends smoking fires using wood that produces the proper smoke characteristics while trying to maintain consistent conditions throughout the smoking process. The monastery's dairy operations present their own set of challenges, as Brother Thomas helps process milk into cheese and other preserved products. Medieval dairy processing lacks the sanitation controls that prevent contamination in modern operations, making spoilage and foodborne illness constant concerns. Milk collection requires working with dairy animals that are often dirty and diseased. Brother Thomas helps milk cows and goats while trying to prevent contamination from animal waste and environmental debris. The milking areas attract flies and other insects that can contaminate dairy products. Cheese making requires managing bacterial fermentation processes that transform liquid milk into solid cheese, while preventing harmful bacteria from contaminating the product. Brother Thomas helps monitor these fermentation processes, learning to recognize proper development versus contamination that could make the cheese dangerous to consume. Cheese aging requires maintaining proper humidity and temperature conditions in storage areas where beneficial molds develop the flavors and textures that make cheese palatable. Brother Thomas monitors aging cheese wheels, turning them regularly while removing any that show signs of harmful contamination. The monastery's medicinal herb operations require cultivating and processing plants that are often dangerous to handle. Many medicinal herbs contain compounds that are toxic in concentrated doses or cause skin reactions with direct contact. Herb harvesting requires working with plants at specific times when their medicinal compounds are most concentrated. Brother Thomas learns to recognize optimal harvesting conditions while protecting himself from plants that can cause allergic reactions or skin irritation. Some medicinal herbs are toxic enough to cause serious illness if handled improperly. Herb processing requires drying, grinding, and extracting active compounds using techniques that expose workers to concentrated plant chemicals. Brother Thomas operates primitive distillation equipment, breathing vapors from boiling plant materials that can cause headaches, nausea, and respiratory irritation. Medicine preparation requires combining processed herbs with other ingredients to create treatments for various ailments. Brother Thomas helps prepare these medicines while trying to avoid exposure to concentrated plant compounds that could cause poisoning if absorbed through skin or accidentally ingested. The seasonal nature of monastic work means that certain times of year bring particularly intense periods of unpleasant labor. Slaughter season requires processing large numbers of animals quickly before meat spoils, creating working conditions that would horrify modern meat processors. Animal slaughter requires killing livestock efficiently while processing carcasses quickly to prevent spoilage. Brother Thomas helps with this work, handling blood and other bodily fluids, while trying to maintain sanitary conditions using only primitive cleaning methods. The slaughter areas attract scavengers and create ideal conditions for disease transmission. Meat processing requires butchering carcasses into portions suitable for preservation and consumption. Brother Thomas works with sharp knives while handling slippery materials that can cause serious injuries if mishandled. The butchering work produces considerable waste that must be disposed of quickly before it attracts pests. Blood collection for sausage making requires gathering animal blood before it coagulates while trying to prevent contamination that could make the finished products dangerous to consume. Brother Thomas handles fresh blood using containers that are difficult to clean thoroughly, increasing the risk of contamination. Sausage making requires stuffing ground meat mixtures into cleaned animal intestines while trying to prevent spoilage that could cause foodborne illness. Brother Thomas helps prepare intestine casings by cleaning them thoroughly and testing for holes that could cause sausages to burst during cooking. Fat rendering for lard production requires heating animal fat until it melts while trying to remove impurities that would affect the quality of the finished product. Brother Thomas tends rendering operations that produce overwhelming odors while working with materials hot enough to cause severe burns. The monastery's construction and maintenance operations require Brother Thomas to work with building materials and techniques that expose him to injury and long-term health problems. Stone cutting and masonry work produce silica dust that damages respiratory systems over time. Quarrying stone requires breaking rocks using primitive tools, while trying to obtain building materials of proper size and quality. Brother Thomas helps operate stone-cutting equipment that produces clouds of rock dust while creating noise levels that damage hearing over time. The quarrying work is dangerous, with risks of serious injury from falling rocks or tool accidents. Mortar preparation requires mixing lime with sand and water to create binding material for stone construction. Brother Thomas works with lime solutions that are caustic enough to burn exposed skin while trying to achieve proper consistency in the mortar mixture. The lime produces vapors that irritate eyes and respiratory systems. Timber preparation requires processing logs into lumber suitable for construction projects. Brother Thomas helps operate primitive sawmills that produce sawdust clouds while creating noise that damages hearing. The sawing work is dangerous, with risks of serious injury from saw blades and moving machinery. Roofing work requires handling materials like lead and slate that present health hazards during installation. Brother Thomas works on rooftops, where falls are a constant danger, while trying to install materials that protect the monastery from weather damage. Lead roofing materials are toxic, causing health problems that accumulate over years of exposure. As the seasons cycle through their endless rhythm, Brother Thomas continues his labors with the same quiet determination that has sustained him through 12 years of monastic service. Each dawn brings new challenges, new unpleasant tasks, and new opportunities to serve his religious community through work that few outsiders could imagine or endure. The monastery bells continue to mark the passage of time, calling the community to prayer while reminding Brother Thomas that even the most disagreeable labor can be transformed into worship through proper intention and steadfast dedication. His work, though unglamorous and often revolting, makes possible the scholarly and spiritual achievements that justify the monastery's existence in medieval society. Tomorrow will bring the same routine, the same demanding tasks, and the same quiet satisfaction that comes from essential work performed without complaint or recognition. Brother Thomas will rise before dawn, answer the call to matins, and begin another day of labor that serves purposes far greater than his own comfort or convenience. The stone corridors will echo with his footsteps as he moves from task to task, carrying with him the accumulated wisdom of years spent managing the unpleasant realities that allow monastic life to flourish. His hands, permanently stained and damaged by years of hard work, continue to serve the community that has given his life meaning and purpose. In the flickering candlelight of evening prayers, Brother Thomas joins his voice with those of his brothers, offering thanks for another day of service completed and strength received. The work continues as it has for centuries, sustained by faith, dedication, and the understanding that all honest labor, no matter how humble or disagreeable, participates in the larger purposes of divine creation. The darkness settles over the monastery like a familiar blanket, bringing temporary rest before another day of challenges begins. But in that darkness, the essential work of medieval civilization continues, performed by dedicated souls who understand that someone must handle the messy realities that make civilized life possible. The rhythmic snoring of his fellow brothers provides a soundtrack to Brother Thomas's restless thoughts as he lies on his straw mattress, knowing that in just a few hours, the bells will summon him to another day of labor that would break most men's spirits. But tonight, his mind wanders to the newest addition to the monastery's operations, something that requires his attention in ways that make even his seasoned constitution quiver with dread. The monastery's newest venture involves the production of vellum, the finest writing material available to medieval scribes. Unlike the relatively straightforward parchment work he's grown accustomed to, vellum requires processing the skins of unborn calves, removed from pregnant cows during slaughter. The delicacy of these fetal skins demands techniques that push the boundaries of what Brother Thomas thought he could endure. The process begins in the slaughterhouse, where Brother Thomas must assist with the grim task of removing unborn calves from their mothers' wombs. The tiny bodies, still warm and slick with amniotic fluid, must be handled with extraordinary care to avoid damaging the precious skins. The sight of these undeveloped creatures, their eyes still sealed shut, their limbs soft and underdeveloped, haunts his dreams. Working with fetal skins requires removing them, while the tissues are still pliable, a process that must be completed within hours of extraction. Brother Thomas uses knives so sharp they could split hairs, carefully peeling away skin that's barely thicker than a spider's web. The work requires steady hands and nerves of steel, as a single slip could destroy materials more valuable than gold. The lime baths used for vellum preparation must be far gentler than those used for regular parchment, requiring Brother Thomas to prepare solutions with the precision of an alchemist. Too strong, and the delicate fetal skin dissolves entirely. Too weak, and the cleaning process fails, leaving organic matter that will rot and ruin the finished product. Stretching fetal skins on frames requires even greater care than adult parchment preparation. The tiny hides must be secured with the gentlest tension, enough to keep them taut, but not so much that they tear under their own delicate weight. Brother Thomas spends hours adjusting and readjusting the stretching apparatus, knowing that months of work can be destroyed by a moment's carelessness. The scraping of vellum demands tools so fine they're barely more than sharpened slivers of bone. Brother Thomas works with instruments that remove microscopic layers of tissue while preserving the skin's integrity. The work requires him to lean so close to his materials that he breathes the faint, sweet odor of fetal tissue throughout the entire process. Quality control for vellum production means inspecting every square inch of processed skin for flaws that would make it unsuitable for the monastery's most important manuscripts. Brother Thomas learns to recognize the subtle differences in texture and transparency that separate masterpiece quality vellum from materials suitable only for practice work. The monastery's expanding medical operations have introduced Brother Thomas to procedures that challenge even his hardened sensibilities. The infirmary now serves as a teaching hospital where visiting physicians demonstrate surgical techniques on live patients, often with results that are more educational than therapeutic. Cataract surgery, one of the few successful operations of the medieval period, requires Brother Thomas to restrain conscious patients while surgeons use needle-like instruments to push clouded lenses back into the eye. The patient's screams during these procedures are particularly haunting because, unlike other surgeries, cataract operations often succeed, meaning the suffering serves a genuine purpose. Bladder stone removal requires cutting into patients' abdomens while they remain fully conscious, held down by Brother Thomas and other assistants. The stones, when finally extracted, are often the size of chicken eggs, their removal leaving gaping wounds that must heal without the benefit of proper sutures or antibiotics. Dental extractions present their own horrors, as medieval dentistry consists primarily of yanking diseased teeth from patients' heads using pliers designed for blacksmith work. Brother Thomas holds patients' heads steady, while barber surgeons wrench and twist until infected teeth finally break free, often taking pieces of jawbone with them. The treatment of battlefield wounds brings soldiers to the monastery with injuries that defy description. Brother Thomas assists with removing arrows that have penetrated deep into bodies, sometimes requiring him to cut away surrounding flesh to access the embedded points. The arrows often break during removal, leaving fragments that must be dug out with crude instruments. Cauterization of wounds. Using red-hot irons produces smoke that carries the smell of burning human flesh throughout the infirmary. Brother Thomas learns to breathe through his mouth during these procedures, trying to avoid inhaling the distinctive odor that seems to linger in his nostrils for days afterward. The monastery's role as a center of natural philosophy exposes Brother Thomas to experiments that blur the line between scientific inquiry and pure madness. Visiting scholars conduct investigations that require materials and procedures which would horrify modern researchers. Alchemical experiments require Brother Thomas to handle substances like mercury, lead compounds, and various acids that burn through containers and human tissue with equal efficiency. He learns to recognize the symptoms of metal poisoning in himself and others, understanding that the pursuit of knowledge comes with physical costs that may not manifest for years. Dissection of living animals for anatomical study requires Brother Thomas to restrain creatures while scholars examine their internal structures. The vivisection of pigs, chosen for their similarity to human anatomy, produces sounds that echo through the monastery's halls, like the soundtrack to hell itself. Botanical experiments involve cultivating poisonous plants, whose mere handling can cause illness or death. Brother Thomas tends gardens of deadly nightshade, foxglove, and hemlock, learning to recognize the subtle signs of plant toxicity in his own body as compounds absorb through his skin during routine care. The testing of various substances on prisoners and condemned criminals requires Brother Thomas to administer experimental treatments that often prove more harmful than helpful. These human experiments, justified as both scientific inquiry and divine justice, produce results that advance medical knowledge while destroying the subjects involved. The monastery's expanded brewing operations have introduced Brother Thomas to the production of stronger alcoholic beverages that require techniques borrowed from alchemical practices. Distillation equipment produces spirits that are powerful enough to use as solvents and medical antiseptics. The distillation process requires maintaining precise temperatures while handling vapors that can cause intoxication through inhalation alone. Brother Thomas tends these operations while trying to avoid breathing the alcoholic fumes that can cause unconsciousness in poorly ventilated spaces. Strong spirits produced through distillation are sometimes used as anesthetics for surgical procedures, requiring Brother Thomas to force alcohol down the throats of conscious patients until they lose consciousness. The amount needed for effective anesthesia often causes alcohol poisoning, making the cure nearly as dangerous as the condition being treated. The monastery's paper-making operations, recently introduced from the Islamic world, require processing materials that create some of the most unpleasant working conditions Brother Thomas has yet encountered. Paper production begins with collecting rags and other textile waste that must be sorted and cleaned before processing. The rags used for papermaking come from throughout the monastery and surrounding community, bringing with them whatever diseases, parasites, and filth they've accumulated during their previous use. Brother Thomas sorts through these materials while trying to identify and remove items too contaminated for safe handling. Cleaning textile waste requires soaking rags in lime solutions that dissolve organic matter while producing caustic vapors. Brother Thomas stirs these cleaning baths using wooden paddles, breathing lime fumes while trying to achieve the level of cleanliness needed for paper production. The pulping of cleaned rags requires beating them with wooden mallets until the textile fibers separate and suspend in water. Brother Thomas performs this beating work for hours, reducing cloth to pulp, while his arms ache from the repetitive motion and his lungs burn from inhaling textile dust. Paper forming requires spreading pulp evenly on the screens while maintaining consistent thickness throughout each sheet. Brother Thomas learns to manipulate these screens while working with wet pulp that must be handled quickly before it begins to decompose. Pressing and drying finished paper requires maintaining proper humidity levels while preventing mold growth that could ruin entire batches. Brother Thomas monitors these drying operations, adjusting conditions while trying to prevent the fungal contaminations that thrive in the moist environment needed for paper production. The monastery's clock tower maintenance presents Brother Thomas with challenges that combine extreme heights with mechanical complexity. The water clocks and primitive mechanical timepieces require constant adjustment and repair, often during severe weather conditions. Climbing the tower requires ascending narrow stone stairs that become slippery with moisture and dangerous during winter months. Brother Thomas makes these climbs while carrying tools and materials needed for clock maintenance, often in darkness or during storms that make the work treacherous. Clock mechanism maintenance requires working with gears and weights that can cause serious injury if they shift unexpectedly. Brother Thomas learns to work around these mechanical hazards while performing adjustments that require precise timing and coordination. Water reservoir cleaning for the water clocks requires emptying and scrubbing tanks that have accumulated algae, debris, and occasionally dead animals that have fallen into the water supply. Brother Thomas performs this cleaning work in cramped spaces where the echo of dripping water creates a constant, maddening rhythm. Weight adjustment for mechanical clocks requires lifting and repositioning heavy stone or metal weights that power the timing mechanisms. Brother Thomas performs this work while balanced on narrow platforms high above the monastery grounds, where a single misstep could prove fatal. The monastery's expanded kitchen operations now include preparation of exotic foods for important visitors, requiring Brother Thomas to work with ingredients and techniques that push the boundaries of medieval cuisine. The preparation of elaborate feasts involves processing materials that would challenge modern health inspectors. Peacock preparation for feast days requires removing the bird's elaborate plumage while keeping the skin intact for reassembly after roasting. Brother Thomas performs this delicate work while trying to preserve feathers that will be used to recreate the bird's appearance on the serving platter. Swan roasting requires special techniques to prevent the meat from becoming too tough while ensuring thorough cooking that kills parasites common in waterfowl. Brother Thomas tends roasting fires that must maintain precise temperatures for hours while he bastes the birds with their own fat. Preparation of various organ meats requires cleaning and processing internal organs from multiple animal species. Brother Thomas works with hearts, livers, kidneys, and other organs that must be cleaned of blood and bile while preserving their structure for cooking. Exotic spice preparation requires grinding and mixing imported seasonings that often contain adulterants and impurities from their long journey to the monastery. Brother Thomas processes these spices while trying to identify and remove foreign materials that could be harmful if consumed. The monastery's textile dyeing operations have expanded to include colors that require materials so rare and expensive that a single mistake could bankrupt the community. Purple dye production requires processing thousands of murex shells to extract tiny quantities of the precious coloring agent. Shell collection for purple dye requires gathering murex shells from rocky coastlines, where the work is dangerous and the shells are difficult to harvest in sufficient quantities. Brother Thomas helps process these shells, extracting dye glands that produce only minute amounts of coloring material. The fermentation process for purple dye requires maintaining precise conditions, while the extracted glands decompose in ways that produce the desired color compounds. Brother Thomas tends these fermentation vats, stirring decomposing shellfish remains while breathing the overwhelming odors produced by rotting marine organisms. Dye concentration requires boiling fermented shell extracts until the liquid reduces to a thick paste containing concentrated purple pigments. Brother Thomas maintains these boiling operations while trying to prevent overheating that would destroy the precious dye compounds. Thread dyeing with purple requires working with materials so valuable that even small quantities represent enormous investments of time and money. Brother Thomas handles these materials with extreme care, knowing that any mistake could waste months of work and resources. The monastery's metalworking operations have expanded to include the production of complex mechanisms for clocks, locks, and other precision instruments. These operations require Brother Thomas to work with techniques that push medieval technology to its limits. File making requires cutting precise teeth into steel bars using techniques that produce showers of metal sparks while demanding extreme accuracy. Brother Thomas helps operate file cutting equipment, working with tools that can cause serious injury while trying to achieve the precision needed for quality files. Lock mechanism production requires assembling tiny components with tolerances that challenge medieval manufacturing capabilities. Brother Thomas works with springs, pins, and gears that must fit together perfectly while using tools that offer little margin for error. Clock gear cutting requires shaping metal teeth with precision that affects the accuracy of timekeeping mechanisms. Brother Thomas helps operate gear cutting equipment while trying to achieve the consistency needed for reliable clock operation. Spring tempering requires heating steel to precise temperatures before cooling it in ways that create the elasticity needed for mechanical springs. Brother Thomas monitors these heat-treating operations while working with materials hot enough to cause severe burns if mishandled. The monastery's glass-making operations have introduced techniques that require Brother Thomas to work with materials and temperatures that challenge human endurance. Glass production involves processes that combine extreme heat with toxic chemicals in ways that test the limits of medieval safety practices. Furnace operation for glass melting requires maintaining temperatures hot enough to liquefy sand and other raw materials, while protecting workers from radiant heat that can cause burns from several feet away. Brother Thomas tends these furnaces while trying to avoid the intense heat that makes the work almost unbearable. Glass blowing requires working with molten materials that remain dangerously hot while being shaped into finished products. Brother Thomas assists glassmakers by preparing tools and maintaining furnace temperatures while trying to avoid contact with materials that can cause severe burns. Colored glass production requires adding metallic compounds to molten glass while trying to achieve consistent colors throughout the finished product. Brother Thomas works with these metallic additives, many of which are toxic enough to cause serious health problems with prolonged exposure. Glass grinding and polishing requires shaping finished pieces using abrasive materials that produce glass dust. Brother Thomas performs this finishing work while breathing particles that accumulate in his lungs and cause respiratory problems that worsen over time. The monastery's bookbinding operations have evolved to include techniques that require materials and processes which challenge Brother Thomas's ability to work with increasingly complex and dangerous substances. Advanced bookbinding involves working with chemicals and materials that test the limits of medieval safety practices. Parchment bleaching requires treating writing materials with chemical solutions that remove stains and discoloration while trying to avoid damaging the parchment itself. Brother Thomas works with these bleaching agents while trying to protect himself from chemicals that can cause burns and respiratory problems. Gilt application for manuscript decoration requires working with gold leaf so thin it tears if handled improperly while using adhesives that contain toxic compounds. Brother Thomas learns to apply these materials while avoiding exposure to chemicals that accumulate in his body over time. Book class manufacturing requires creating metal hardware that must be precisely fitted to each individual book, while using techniques that involve considerable risk of injury. Brother Thomas helps forge these clasps while working with hot metal and sharp tools that can cause serious wounds. Advanced binding techniques require sewing book signatures, using threads treated with preservatives that prevent decay while exposing workers to chemicals that can cause skin reactions and other health problems. Brother Thomas performs this sewing work while trying to minimize his exposure to treated materials. As winter deepens around the monastery, Brother Thomas reflects on the expanding complexity of his duties and the increasing challenges that each new season brings. The work continues to evolve, demanding skills and endurance that push the boundaries of what any individual should be expected to provide. The bells continue their ancient rhythm, marking time and calling the community to prayer, while Brother Thomas prepares for another night of restless sleep before tomorrow's labours begin. His body bears the accumulated damage of 13 years spent serving purposes greater than his own comfort, and he understands that each passing season adds new challenges to work that already tests the limits of human endurance. Yet in the darkness of his cell, listening to the wind howl through the monastery's stone corridors, Brother Thomas finds meaning in labour that few could comprehend or appreciate. His work, though increasingly complex and demanding, serves the larger purposes of learning, faith, and civilization that justify whatever personal cost his service might require. The candle burns low beside his straw mattress as Brother Thomas closes his eyes, knowing that dawn will bring new challenges, new techniques to master, and new tests of his dedication to the monastic life that has defined his existence. The work never ends, but neither does the quiet satisfaction that comes from service rendered without complaint or recognition.